Well, after a decade of flooding economies with money, key central banks may be ready to start turning off the taps. We've got our managing editor for Asia across asset markets, Chris Anstey, joining us from Tokyo. Chris, walk us through the impact that central banks have had on markets. What's going to happen in 2018 when it all goes away?
Well, that's right, Angie. We seem to be approaching an inflection point here. It's a long time coming, more than a decade. I remember the day in August 2007 when the ECB came in with unlimited liquidity in money markets. I actually woke up the New York Fed spokesman that morning asking him what the U.S. reaction would be. And since that time, since the 2007-2008 crisis, we've seen the big three central banks, the Federal Reserve, the ECB, Bank of Japan, expand their collective balance sheets over $14 trillion. The ECB has been the latest to jump on the phasing out track. The Federal Reserve was the first on this last month, starting to shrink its balance sheet already. ECB tentatively penciling in next September for the potential end date for QE. Bank of Japan is seen continuing its purchase program of government bonds, but not enough to outweigh the shrinkage from the Fed and the ECB going neutral. So most economists anticipate the collective balance sheet in the fourth quarter of next year will finally start shrinking. And that has a potential impact on markets, just given how much liquidity the central banks have been pumping in for many, many years now.
Well, Chris, who do you think is going to have the biggest impact on the markets here, and where should investors be paying particularly attention?
Well, that's a good question. So some folks have done some of the numbers on this, the calculations. Torsten Slok over at Deutsche Bank has shown that if you look at the Federal Reserve's purchases of bonds, it was basically a net zero impact because the U.S. government stepped up its borrowing. So the supply of treasuries was keeping pace with the Federal Reserve's purchases. The ECB, however, has been buying 7 times net issuance of government bonds. So just taking out an enormous amount from the bond market and pulling yields down in Europe. Now, what that has done has forced European investors to go overseas to look for yields. And the folks over at Oxford Economics estimate that about $1.3 trillion of euro area investor money has flowed into other bond markets outside of Europe just since the QE program began in Europe in 2015. So that's had an enormous impact on global yields. And when the ECB finally stops in the third quarter of next year, that could have a real ripple effect.
Well, absolutely. That's a great point, because right now what we're even seeing in China is that they're getting into the bond market and offering yield, trying to sop up this demand here. So is China going to have a role here, especially with the PBOC looking to be under new leadership next year?
Well, China is a real is obviously much more opaque, hard to understand than the other central banks. They don't have the same kind of communication that the others do. They don't have the level of transparency that the others do. But we have seen that at times, they can surprise markets, jolt markets, because people don't really understand exactly what their intentions are. There was that devaluation of the yuan back in the summer of 2015 that spooked global markets. And we know that the Chinese have set a priority of deleveraging their economy next year. So how they handle that will be a key question. And will they be able to communicate in a way that avoids the kinds of shocks that we've seen in the past?
Okay, does it matter that all of these central banks as well are changing, perhaps those at the helm? We have Jerome Powell, but possibly even in China, PBOC's Zhou Xiaochuan might be stepping aside as well.
This is another challenge that investors need to keep an eye on. So all the indications are, and we've been reporting this throughout the day, that Jay Powell at the Fed will be a continuity chair following Janet Yellen. Obviously, he never dissented from any of Janet Yellen's votes. So people don't see a huge change there. There's always communication risk, however. Being the top guy at the Fed, it'll be it will be no easy task for him to communicate and make sure that he doesn't avoid communication or comments that could potentially be misinterpreted because people don't understand what the new guy means. In China as well, we have seen times when Zhou Xiaochuan has gone quiet for months at a time. Will the new person be more communicative? All of these questions remain outstanding.